to Russia. Wanna drive a tank, drink and have some fun. Until we see they don't take me to Russia. So what can you be? Vodka almost free. Hard bases motherland, take me to Russia. I wanna drive a tank, drink and have some fun. Until we see they don't take me to Russia. Gangsta KGB, Russian bears gonna set you free.
And hey everyone, welcome once again to what is the official concluding lecture of Russian foreign policy. And I say concluding because we're at the end of the 6-week course that I'm offering through the Rutgers MA program in UN and Global Studies. It's amazing that the fastest 6 weeks of the entire year come when I'm teaching any of these 6-week online courses. But that doesn't mean that the class itself in the public scholarship realm has to come to an end. In fact, there's a couple of topics from this lecture that gave me some ideas to do for standalone lectures. And obviously, from the comment sections over the past couple of weeks, there's certainly an interest in this material, and I couldn't be happier with the way in which this class went in terms of the public scholarship route. The comments, the likes, and especially those of you that went over to my Patreon page and are now my first core Patreon sponsors, just really makes me really makes me appreciative. So I really want to thank all of you for your support, your interest, your enthusiasm, because this gives me really all the reason that I need to keep this going in the coming weeks. So, just so you know, this is really the last of the official chapters, the official lectures of class. And if you feel inclined to, become a patron, become a sponsor of my material, it really, really helps me out. And it just, as I've always said, weans me away from institutionalized academia, something that I think I will put in a standalone playlist. Anyway, let's jump into the material here. I really want to just finish out this, what turned out to be a really great class, even for my enrolled students. And the readings for this week, they're all contemporary, right? And they are largely drawn from Foreign Policy magazine because it's one of the few mediums that is able to get the material out early in time, right? I mean, we are talking about material events that are happening in the here and the now. So any academic articles, any academic assessments, they're not going to really be available until, I would say, September, October at the absolute earliest. And these are only being written in the early, in the beginning of the year. So, the academic stuff takes much longer to become available. And, as many of you know, they're behind paywalls. So, no one can really read them. So the Hirsch, the Walt, the French, and the Stanovaya articles are available on Foreign Policy. And I also included some recommended readings from the last time that I taught this class. The Moidal article, Putin may want to be emperor, but Russia isn't an imperial power, Foreign Policy as well. Petro returning to the discussions with his Are We Reading Russia Right article. And Thomas Graham, also in Foreign Affairs, Let Russia Be Russia. I don't make any money off of Foreign Affairs here. It's either Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy. It's just it's the closest thing that I think comes between that nice medium between journalism and more academic, scholarly readings here. And the agenda for today, I really would like to do about 4 things. First is make an assessment of the current state of affairs in Ukraine. Right? The war is still going on. There's no sign of it abating anytime soon. I would like to review the opening questions that we had with this course. Right? What is Russia in the world today? Is Russia a great power? Is it an aggressive power? A defensive power? I also would like, and this is something that I may do more of in an additional lecture, and that is connecting foreign policy perceptions with media coverage and bias. Because I think that many of you will agree with me on either side of the aisle that what we hear about Russia, what we hear about Ukraine, comes with a significant amount of bias and subjectivity, right? And this is especially true in Western press, where the early assessments of the outbreak of the war predicted that Russia would collapse within a month, right? Putin would be overthrown. If he didn't die from whatever disease the British media kept claiming that he had. But then on the opposite side, there is this understanding from pro-Russian media channels that it's just it's an inevitable cakewalk to a decisive victory, and whether that includes taking Kiev or more likely just ending in the capture of Odessa, we don't know how long that's going to be. And so, we have to ask ourselves, and this is a broader issue, which is why I think I want to make this a standalone lecture, not specifically focused on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, is that, is the news that we're getting today actually news, or, are they increasingly disguised as editorials, right? Do they want us to think a certain way, or are they actually informing us? And then finally, what is to be done? This is kind of a traditional way that I end every class by asking, okay, with everything that we've discussed, where do we go, from here? So I'm hoping that, you'll join me for the next and officially final hour and change as we wrap up this class. Now, as it stands, and, this is about the most current assessment right now, right? The war in Ukraine seems to be at some kind of standstill, maybe, a summer lull here. But what is abundantly clear is that territory in Ukraine's east and south that has been captured by Russian special forces, the local militias of Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as a bunch of other pro-Russian mercenaries, if they haven't gained any additional territory in the last few weeks, they're not losing any either. Right? There is no major, there has yet to be this much publicized Ukrainian counterattack. We've been hearing about this inevitable counterstrike to capture Kherson. Earlier today, President Zelensky openly said that the war will not end until Ukraine captures or recaptures all of its territory, including Crimea. So, unless I and a whole bunch of other policymakers are very, very wrong, we are either talking about just perpetual war, or, Zelensky is, trying to be overly optimistic here. But, so far, and, here we are about early mid-August 2022. And the inconvenient truth is that Russia continues to hold military leverage. Right? I mean, there's no denying that. And I think even the major Western media outlets, the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, The Guardian, they're begrudgingly coming to that recognition, right? That despite whatever they wanted to let you think early on in the war, that Russia was sort of just engaging in one Hail Mary pass after another, or made a strategic blunder by trying to take Kiev, or they're running out of ammunition. The loyalties are withering away for Putin's inner circle. Whatever it is that you want, right? Russia continues to hold military advantage. Right? There's no question about that. And I think that the perceptive tide turned once Mariupol was captured, and since then, right, Russian forces have made steady gains in both the east and the south. Slow, but steady, but as I've already said, they're not yielding, right, any major territory. Now that leads us to ask, well, what's the end goal? Right? I mean, are they going to take over the whole country? Are they eventually going to roll into Kiev? Is the reason why the war has sort of bogged down the way that it is because the eastern and southern regions are the most industrious, right? They're the most urbanized, right? So they literally are going, right, town by town, city by city. But once that has been captured, is there just effectively just open land for Russian forces to just kind of roll on over until they reach the outskirts of Kiev, right? We don't know, right? It really is anyone's guess here. The other inconvenient truth is that Ukraine remains a line of defense for both the United States and NATO. And whether some people want to admit it or not, and this is especially true for people in the U.S. State Department and Pentagon, the U.S. is invested in a proxy war. I mean, there's really no other way to say this, is that it's a proxy war going on with the amount of money and resources that are being lent. And I say lent, not given, because I'm pretty certain that there is going to be, at some point, a reckoning, a financial reckoning. And I don't know if Zelensky's going to be around to see the bar tab, but it's going to be hefty. But, the United States, the UK, and by lesser extension, NATO members are keeping the conflict alive by sending as much financial support, military support, and yes, mercenaries as well, to give the Ukrainian side at least some modicum of belief, right, that they can fight and, live to fight another day. But of course, it leads us to wonder whether or not it will turn the tide, right? Will the Ukrainian side gain the advantage and be able to push the Russian special forces back? And right now, there's no evidence to suggest that, right? If there is this much talked about counterattack in Kherson, if the Ukrainian army and all of their, special mercenary forces are able to take back, not a village, but I'm talking about like a key urban city, well, then we might be able to talk. But right now, confidence is sort of drying up. And media attention is, going elsewhere. I mean, we have the whole Taiwan issue that arose about a week and a half ago. We have flared up conflicts in Israel and, the Palestinian territories. Media attention in the West just it focuses on one hashtag for about a month or so, and then it just kind of goes off elsewhere. And, I'm beginning to wonder whether or not by the time September comes around, people will say, Ukraine, that is just so June, that is so July 2022, right? I don't know. And that leaves us to wonder, what is the future of any Ukrainian state? What will it look like? How powerful, how authoritative, how sovereign will it really be? And, another major inconvenient truth is that the European Union is buckling under the costs and consequences of sanctions. So it's not Russia that is going to be economically starved. It's not Russia that's going to be financially ruined. It is a number of European countries that are realizing that this is not ending anytime soon, and with the oil embargoes and the gas embargoes, they're thinking to themselves, they're running out of fuel. We're running out of fuel, and how are we going to keep ourselves warm in the winter? And right now, all the reports are saying that they're all running towards solar energy. I guess you can do, but we're going back to coal and firewood. So for all of you that are thinking, well, what is this going to have as an impact on the environment and climate? Like, well, there's going to be a lot of trees that will be cut down. There'll be a lot of wood. I'm sure that Europe in the wintertime is going to smell nice with that firewood. But it's not Russia that seems to be in dire straits. And it's not even these smaller EU countries like Slovenia or Slovakia or the Czech Republic. We're talking like Germany. Right? We're talking Germany, we're talking Italy, we're talking Austria, we're talking France even for that matter. And so this leads us to want to ask, how long can a unified foreign policy last? And this is something that is part of, larger IR studies when we consider the role of sanctions, united collective sanctions against a target country. The target country needs to effectively be hit, right? They need to really be punched in the gut within like the first week or two, right? They need to realize how bad it is. If they can weather the storm within the first 2 weeks, month at the absolute most, then the sanctions have proven to be useless, right? And Russia is one of those countries that has, as we've already discussed, been able to diversify its exports. If they can look to China, to India, increasingly to Turkey, to Africa, and others, Russia is just simply turning away from Europe. And we begin to realize that it's not Russia that depends on Europe, but it's Europe that depends on Russia. Russia is going to continue to export natural resources, but just simply not westward to Europe. What is Europe going to do if they realize that Russia is their biggest market? They might be able to diversify, but not anytime soon. So how long can a united foreign policy last before we begin to see a few countries defecting, right? And right now, Hungary, Slovakia, Austria, they've all decided, listen, the sanctions are nice at the official level, but, hint, hint, behind, the scenes here, we're already purchasing Russian gas through and via rubles. So, Russia is going to, be under some kind of obligation to deliver that. And of course, it's all going to go through Ukraine or Poland or the rest of Central Europe. And the minute that happens, and the minute that there is already this break in this united front, the sanctions mean absolutely nothing, right? The United States can certainly say we're not buying Russian gas when prior to that, our market for Russian gas was only 3%. So we can afford that. The United States can certainly afford that. Continental Europe, different story. And another thing, and this I think I'll do in a separate lecture, is that if you've all been noticing in the recent past 2-3 weeks or so, there's been some copycat scenarios that have been developing in other disputed territories, right? Taiwan, Kosovo, and even Nagorno-Karabakh. That's that disputed territory within Azerbaijan that's been controlled more recently, less so, by Armenia. But it all seems to point to a larger issue, and I think I will focus on this in a separate lecture to keep the ball rolling here. But larger powers are testing the waters. They're trying to see how far they can go in terms of either laying claims to contested territories, asserting their current influence over these contested territories, or even more so, challenging other great powers to who gets to influence those contested territories. So right now, Taiwan is kind of this little piece of, territory that's being fought over right now just rhetorically and symbolically between mainland China and the United States. And I have no particular love for Nancy Pelosi for a myriad of reasons, but I gotta say, that was a ballsy move that she made because it effectively put the burden of response on China's part, right? And what will they do in response to, a high-ranking U.S. official going to Taiwan and treating it as if it was a state, a bilateral state meeting? When it comes to Kosovo, if you were paying attention, the Serbian army was about 6 hours away from being like, oh crap, we're going to have to dismobilize and invade, which would have led to a whole bunch of other consequences, considering that the area is nominally, at least officially, under the security blanket of NATO. But that would have easily have led to the Kosovo Albanian authorities raising the red flag or whatever flag they wanted, probably the American flag, and saying, help us, oh, look, there's Serbia invading once again, blah, 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 right? And the same thing goes for Nagorno-Karabakh. The region flared up a couple of years ago between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Azerbaijan now holds the tactical advantage in a region that it had been effectively expelled from for more than 25 years. But in all of these cases, right, we are finding the presence of one great power trying to flex its muscles. Welcome back to 19th century realpolitik, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, Russia just kind of threw down the gauntlet and said, all right, let's just see what we're doing. I mean, we're talking about one country that invaded another sovereign country, but they've already seen the limits of what the response will be. And short of nuclear war, which no one wants, or a full-scale NATO mobilization, which is not going to happen, Ukraine, Taiwan, Kosovo, Karabakh, right? I mean, all of these regions, which is kind of a proxy for other powers, are going to remain under the spotlight and most likely on the operating table. So, how might the war in Ukraine end? And, we talked about this last week with my discussion with Dr. Petro. And this is my 2 cents, right? I'm just kind of giving my own predictions here because none of us really know how this is going to be, right? You listen to these talking heads on TV, take that with an enormous grain of salt. Like not even a grain, take that with a salt mine. Because none of these people, and it's especially true when it comes to CNN, MSNBC, blah, 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 right? They're all going to still probably say in some way that, Russia is going to buckle, right? At some point, the ground's going to fall under Putin's chair, and that's about it. That's not the case at all, right? The way that I see this, and take it however way that you want, is that there will most likely be no decisive victory for any side, right? There's not going to be this decisive Russian victory where they all just kind of roll into Kiev, and Zelensky, either boards a helicopter with his wife, his kid, and some Vogue photographer. He's not going to go down in some Hollywood movie moment in some bunker, right? I mean, I sincerely doubt that Kiev is going to be occupied. And that leads us to consider, right, the long-term territorial costs of Russia's conquest. There doesn't really seem to be any likelihood, and again, I could be wrong, but the territory that Russian forces are capturing in Ukraine's east and south, they're not so much being captured as they're being cored and integrated. And this is another reason why the conflict is taking as long as it is, right? Russia is not, constantly fighting a one-on-one battle with this, determined Ukrainian territorial units here. They're not. What they end up doing is they capture a major town or a major city within the region, and then they stop. They reload, they core, they integrate the area into an envisioned future expanded Russian state. So, for instance, as I'm recording this lecture, even though the city of Zaporozhye is still in Ukrainian hands and may remain, we don't know, but the areas of the Zaporozhian Oblast, right, the region of Zaporozhye, has, they created this, this little local council, whatever it is, and the local officials decided unanimously, right, to integrate, to annex themselves with Russia. So the same goes with Kherson and Mariupol, and you can bet your bottom ruble that is going to be the same for Donetsk and Lugansk. So we are talking here about full annexation. And this is the first time since, really, 1945, that borders of sovereign states may very well be changed, right? And what's the fallout from that? Among other things, right, Russia will remain stigmatized by Western liberal democracies for the foreseeable future. That much is certain. But at the same time, right, the Western powers that seem to be defending Ukraine in the name of some form of liberal democratic philosophy, are also losing ground. When we kind of think about the United States and its investment in Ukraine, what are they doing it for? And if you honestly believe that they're doing it to preserve freedom and democracy in Ukraine, God bless you for being optimistic, but that's not the case, at all. What we find increasingly now is that, the high glossy color brochure of Western liberal democracy that's given to, all of these, would-be members of the Western alliances, it's image over substance. And this is especially true in many of the liberal democratic states today that, let's say we look at the United States, we can see an invigorated and mobilized Republican Party that if they come to power, if they seize Congress in November 2022 and the presidency in 2024, I can guarantee you that there's going to be a significant rapprochement with Russia. Doesn't mean that they're pro-Putin, but, there is this sense of, I think Trump kind of got it most clearly where, he recognized, maybe indirectly, spheres of influence around the world, right? The whole America First thing. So the United States is effectively going to, or has a high risk of, receding back into its own sphere while leaving contested regions to be within the spheres of others. Russia, China, what have you. This, of course, asks us, or leads us to ask about Ukraine, which, if you really want my TLDR version of this, Ukraine is screwed. I mean, I really hate to say that. Like, Ukraine is screwed. I don't foresee Ukraine regaining control of its territorial borders that it had, not only before 2022, but even before 2014. Like, I just don't see Ukraine regaining control of Crimea, not without a major, major world conflict. Again, if I'm wrong, I am more than happy to issue a mea culpa video as an add-on, to this. But at the same time, also, there will be no decisive defeat. Right? So don't expect the Russian army to all of a sudden lose ground, run out of ammunition. Right? Don't envision the Ukrainians to, finally get all the weapons or the HIMARS, whatever it is we're calling them, right? And just suddenly push Russia not just back to the border, but also deep within Russian territory. It's just not going to happen. Don't expect Putin to die of some sudden disease, as much as the British press like to assume, because in the event that Putin steps down or die or whatever happens, right, there's another Putin waiting in the wings, right? So it's not like as soon as Putin is removed from power, some Alexei Navalny will come to power and change Russia. It's not going to happen, right? It is not. In fact, I'd even go so far as to say right now, Putin is the most sane version of leadership that we have. There is a higher probability of a post-Putin leader being even more aggressive, right? Being even more forceful, not just in Ukraine, but against the West. So don't expect Russia to walk away from this defeated. The war may come to some ceasefire, but Russia is going to most likely retain significant, if not absolute, executive influence over these territories that they currently control because they are coring them into the Russian state. Now, what about the United States? Right? Will there suddenly be this major breakthrough where the world realizes the moral superiority of liberal democracy? I don't think so. Right? Let's just envision. Let's envision that Biden either gets reelected in 2024 or the Democrats keep control of the White House. I don't know, Harris takes over. Oh, dear God. But, it's whatever. Sorry, that part came out a little too loud. But just visualize the current patterns of American foreign policy, because it really doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat. I think that we are, especially if we are moving into a multipolar world, the whole liberalist notion of democratic peace theory is, if it still is used, will be little more than a lubricant, a fuel for, I think, a more obvious foreign policy of Wilsonian realism, right? And that is, the United States is going to continue with coercive diplomacy to push, influence a number of states that they feel either are part of their sphere of influence or more likely should be part of their sphere of influence, away from, right, the Chinas, the Russias, the Irans, the Brazils, the whatever, the Indias, whatever countries that they want. And that may, of course, go back to more obvious Cold War models of quasi-democratic, not entirely authoritarian, but certainly not legitimate, full-blown democratic consolidated governments that are more pro-Western than they are pro-democratic, right? So this is the way in which U.S. soft power will most likely be utilized. And, it's the type of neoconservatism that characterized the foreign policy of George W. Bush and may continue, right, if we looked at, let's say, the foreign policy of Donald Trump. Either way, I think that Ukraine, there might be multiple Ukraines. There might be a caretaker government in Kiev, and it depends on whether they're going to look towards Moscow or Washington. If there is a new government in Kiev that returns to its pro-Moscow leanings, there will most likely be a shadow government somewhere, probably based in Lviv or worse, in exile or whatever it is. There's going to be multiple variations on Ukraine. And how the peace agreement will look will determine which great power is willing to accept reality. And that, of course, is if Russia comes to the peace agreement with the United States with a Sharpie marker and a map and says, we're redrawing the map of Ukraine, and if the United States agrees to that, well then, there's a whole bunch of new issues that we'll be dealing with in the 21st century. And the good people at Rand McNally are suddenly going to be very, very busy issuing new atlases every year. Because if that happens, well then, Taiwan is certainly up for grabs. Kosovo is up for grabs. Karabakh is, so I'm getting ahead of myself here. But if the United States agrees to this, for the sake of saving what can be saved, we got a whole bunch of new things to talk about. And, what a time to be engaged in political science, public scholarship. Either way, folks, and I really hate to say this because I don't think anybody's going to disagree that the biggest losers are the ordinary Ukrainians, right? I mean, it's a tragic understanding that Ukraine's future under any of these situations remains bleak. I mean, as I've already mentioned, that the country has lost effective control over large swaths of its territory in the east and the south. And there is no indication that Russia is running out of steam. So that implies that there will be continued encroachment. Most likely, the attempted capture of Nikolaev, Zaporozhye, and of course Odessa. Now, if that happens, the Ukrainian economy is completely, almost entirely controlled by that of Russia, right? Ukraine loses its seaports. And there might be a caretaker Vichy Ukrainian state that emerges, but it will take the orders, really from Russia. But even before the outbreak of conflict, and even if, let's just say, we were to cut off the Russian areas, right? And this was sort of opined prior to 2022 and shortly after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And, it's not a popular one, but it was to the Ukrainian government. Well, what if we just got rid of these pro-Russian areas, right? They don't do us any good. They're nothing more than a hindrance when it comes time for elections, because all they do is vote for the pro-Moscow parties. Then we get rid of them. We get rid of those people, right? We've got a smaller but very determined pro-Western, pro-NATO, pro-EU coalition, core group of voters. We're good, right? So who cares about the East? It's, a post-industrial wasteland. Even if that happens, which it won't because no state voluntarily gives up claims to its territory, the Ukrainian state has just been one successive government just mired in political corruption and cronyism after another. So, it's like even if you take the Russian element out, right, the pro-Western, pro-NATO, pro-EU, pro-whatever Ukrainian political elite are little more than opportunistic oligarchs, right? Ukraine has been one hybrid regime after another since 1991. And yes, it's fair enough to say that there is comparatively better political rights and civil liberties in Ukraine than Russia, but I wouldn't put this country in the display case for would-be passersby to purchase. And given the situation now, there is little to no prospects for Ukraine's membership in either the European Union or NATO. As far as NATO is concerned, that's all but off the table, all right? And, one day Zelensky says we're going to take that off the table. Another day he's saying we're not giving up on our NATO and EU integration. Even if the war ends today and there is a UN-agreed summit, a Security Council resolution, right? Everybody agrees, shake hands, whatever. Ukraine is so mired in economic debt, political corruption, and infrastructural dysfunctionality that even if EU membership was envisioned for Ukraine, we are talking not about years, but decades away right? Absolute, and I'm not even saying like in 10 years. We're talking maybe 20, 30 years. There are countries in the Balkans that still have yet to get into the EU, and at this point, the EU is not even thinking of increasing its membership. And they're not going to give membership to Ukraine just because of some sympathy, right? Ukraine is considered to be an EU aspirant country at this point, but so has Turkey, right? Turkey is still in the waiting list. So is Serbia and Macedonia and Albania and Montenegro, right? So it doesn't mean that just because you're an EU applicant that you're going to get in anytime soon. Serbia has been trying to get in for more than 10 years. Turkey, since the early, I don't even think even late 1990s, I don't even remember. But at this point, right, it's kind of like, is anybody even checking up anymore? So Euro fatigue is certainly a major issue. And when it comes to Ukraine's membership in NATO, it requires unanimous votes. Now, right now, this is actually a really good way of looking at this. Right now, individual NATO countries are voting on granting membership to Sweden and Finland. And, the obvious countries voted for them. The United States, in the last day or so, right, voted to ratify NATO membership for Sweden and Finland. But the big countries that are likely to spoil that have yet to vote. Turkey is one big one, which probably explains why Russia is so amenable towards deepening relations with Turkey. Right? And if all it takes is for Erdogan to say, no membership, well, then that's that. I mean, that's just how it's going to be. And if it's not Turkey, there's Croatia or Hungary, right? Or a number of other countries that could look at this and say, look, this is just going to ratchet up the security dilemma, not increase security. So there's no guarantee, right, that Sweden and Finland are going to get in. I could be wrong, but look at what Ukraine has to deal with, especially if it doesn't have full control over its territories. And finally, if you want to talk about Ukraine's bleak future, even before the outbreak of war, many analysts had looked at Ukraine's attempt at detaching from the Russian economic grid and reattaching to Europe as economic suicide. It's like shock therapy, but 10 times worse because it's self-imposed. So what this implies, right, is that all of the infrastructure that Ukraine has carried since the Soviet Union that naturally works towards and receives goods from Russia, right, are going to be dismantled. And they're going to be effectively rebuilt for Germany, Austria, Hungary, the Baltics, what have you. Best case scenario is that this reconfiguration is going to take about 5, maybe 10 years of restructuring, which, like shock therapy says, hey, at the end of the day, everything's going to be great. We're all going to be rolling in cash. But in that time, in that period of transition, right, it's going to be, just absolutely catastrophic. And the Ukrainian economy just was, plummeting since 2014. So that also doesn't even factor in the notion of depopulation and migration, right? So if the Ukrainian state can secure state-to-state agreements, which will allow them to look for jobs and, basically migrate elsewhere, they're going to do so, right? Ukraine has been under a brain drain since well before 2014, but definitely now, no one's going back. Like, no one's going back. There have been sizable Ukrainian communities in Poland, in Germany, in Austria, in Italy, in France, and elsewhere. And, the youth, the 20-somethings, the 30-somethings, for them, they don't care about Ukraine's future. They might think about going back there years later to retire, hoping that they're going to have enough money accumulated living abroad so they can live well. But they have no investment within the country. They're living abroad right now. And given the state of Ukraine right now, all those refugees, how many of them are going to want to go back? I mean, I can't say that none of them will, but clearly, right, with everything going on, the ordinary Ukrainian is going to say, why would I? Right? Why would I want to do this? And, before the outbreak of war, depending upon where you were geographically, this economic restructuring may have been more lucrative. So if you lived in Ukraine's west, like around Lviv, well, this was just natural. I mean, this is just like Poland's right there. Hungary is right there. Europe, Central Europe is right there. It makes much more sense. If you're living in Ukraine's east, in the Donetsk region, right, in the areas where the fighting is going on, that's economic suicide because Russia is right there. And if you're in Kiev, I mean, this is kind of the curse of Kiev. Kiev has been always burdened with this insurmountable challenge of trying to placate, really, the power centers of Lviv in the west and Donetsk in the east. And that might explain why Yanukovych was all like, hey, look, can we be part of the Eurasian Customs Union and the EU? You know, we can kind of serve as like this conduit, this in one way, out the other way transfer point between both of these things. As far as I was concerned, as far as I remember, Russia said, yeah, sure, no problem. The EU said, nope, you got to be one or the other, right? So if you have to choose one or the other, where you are and how you are, it's going to be economically costly. But to detach from Russia, as much as this sounds unpopular in Western media, is in fact, right, short-term economic suicide, right? Absolutely the case here. Now, what I find equally interesting about all of this is that Ukraine it's the example, it's the model for a bigger picture of the international arena in 2022. And I'm sort of jumping ahead here. Just think September. So think Ukraine, think Taiwan, think India, think the growing / waning influence of American foreign policy. And those of us that know the book are drawn to some of the earlier chapters in Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, right? And it's a book that I will admit I don't want to agree with. I never was a fan of. Huntington is, more of he has more followers in, let's say, the U.S. State Department than the halls of academia, because we didn't want to think that, his predictions of the world would be this stark as well as simplistic. But here we are. The West versus Rest model seems to be emerging, even though it doesn't have to be, but it seems like we're moving, in that direction, right? American foreign policy it seems to be choosing to be more belligerent towards Russia and China instead of cooperative. I will say, right, both personally as well as professionally, the whole issue around Ukraine could have been solved, could have been negotiated between the U.S. and Russia. Even if it was just simply a universal recognition that Ukraine would be militarily neutral. Russia would most likely have agreed to Ukraine becoming eventually a member of the EU in exchange for NATO truly saying we're done. Not one step for no Ukraine, no Georgia, no Moldova, no nothing else. But it seems that the United States is still bent on either containing the perceived threat from Russia and China, and I don't know whether they are willing to put up as opposed to shut up, right? I don't know where this is going to go. And the problem is that if we have already seen the limits of American foreign policy in the 2000s and the 2010s, I don't see that downward trend reversing. This is especially true when 2022 is clearly showing an emergent periphery. In addition to Huntington's book, I definitely recommend, and I'll put the link to the description in the thing below here, but Immanuel Wallerstein's book, World Systems Theory, is one of those books that I always love reading, I always love agreeing with, and I don't think that it gets the publicity. I don't think it gets the fame that it deserves. But Wallerstein's division of the world, really, if I was to say, into two large areas, right? The core and the periphery. The core, the industrial core, the developed Western democracies, surprise, surprise, they all, were colonial powers, and the periphery, the developing world, also the colonies of the core. The periphery is emerging as independent, autonomous actors. The periphery, which used to be China, Middle East, Africa, Latin America, among others, they are developing their own voice in foreign policy. And this is really, if you think about this, the best reflection of an international community that we've ever seen, right? International community does not and should not be managed and regulated by the United States, but the United Nations instead. And that means that the U.S. has a seat at the table. They clearly have a seat at the table, but they need to realize that the table is no longer a rectangle with them sitting at the head, but it's round, right? And beyond just simply the periphery emerging, we're also noticing the limits of Western-based liberal democracy. And this is something that Huntington, I think, very astutely noted back when he was writing this. I think it got misunderstood. But Huntington had said that, and he wrote this in the 1990s. He said, there are large parts of the world that are going to reject the notion of liberal democracy coming from the West. And, you read further into that, he is not saying that these non-Western cultures or civilizations, they're not opposed to democracy, right? It's not like their culture has no history of democracy, but it's the type of democracy. It is the model of democracy that is specifically coming from the West. Democracy can be universal, but democracy, like the sovereign democracy model that Russia has, is more custom designed. It's something that needs to work with and be congruent with the cultural, religious, and the traditional attitudes and beliefs of each society. So rather than democracy being this type of franchise that the Americans are selling, right? It's kind of like United States goes into a country and says, you have some decent food, but you don't have McDonald's. You could put your food to better use if you open up a McDonald's. Whereas a lot of these countries are saying, well, it would be nice if we had one because it looks kind of, who doesn't want a McDonald's? But at the same time, we like our own food. And our food is actually better, So it's like, instead of saying close down your little eatery and replace it with a KFC or a McDonald's, right? The idea here is that, look, if America, you want to eat at McDonald's, that's all fine and good. And look, there's better places to eat than McDonald's. I mean, beef is beef, but, you want something fast? Sure, go to McDonald's. You want a better steak? Go to Peter Luger's, okay? The point that I'm trying to make here is that Western-based liberal democracy is going to hit a wall at some point. There's going to come to a point where a culture, a civilization, says Huntington, is going to respond by saying thanks, but no thanks. Right? We don't need it. Now, to a realist, to a constructivist, to a Marxist, to a world systems analyst, which is kind of like a Marxist, this is going to come as obvious. Right? It's going to come as an absolute obvious thing. It's also going to be seen as not directly contentious. To a liberalist, right? To somebody that espouses the notion of Wilsonian liberalism, right? We got to spread the gospel of democracy around the world. This is an affront. This is an attack. This is, without going into the research, an assumption that unless the group in question receives the gospel of democracy from the West, the US, the UK, the EU, whatever, they're going to remain mired in their own, cultural idiosyncrasies, which, well, take a look at Syria or Afghanistan or Russia for that matter, right? We can't save Russia, but we better save Ukraine. Because if we don't, Ukraine is going to just exist like some tin pot dictatorship like Belarus does, okay? Now, I've already noted, right, that if we connect this with larger studies and understandings of multipolarity, this could either be inclusive or contentious, okay? So if you look at the world as a multipolar alignment today, from the lens of realism, constructivism, or Marxism, it can be inclusive. It can be contentious, but it can also be inclusive. And all signs of Russian foreign policy's model of sovereign democracy envisions the United States as having a major role to play in the world. But that role needs to be cooperative. It needs to be harmonious with other great powers, right? And these are the emergent BRICS countries. And I don't want to just simply say Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but others, right? We are the notion of BRICS, and I just kind of loosely use BRICS here, is the rest, right? The rest. The transatlantic network is the United States' alliance system from the Cold War that remained intact and expanded to include Central Europe and parts of the Middle East. The rest is effectively just that. And at this stage of the game, it is much more difficult for the United States to gain another major ally like it had between the period of 45 to 90. So we need to note the importance of the United States as a fallen hegemon, because it's the last one to understand that it no longer is that global hegemon. It has a spot at the major, at the table of major world players and deciders. Make no mistake about that. But will the United States swallow its pride and share that table with the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, among others? And if the answer is yes, then liberalism remains regional. It's no longer global. If the answer is no, well, then multipolarity is going to remain contentious, because it is going to be a clash of civilizations, Huntington argues. It doesn't have to be. But if the West realizes that it's us versus barbarity, right? Rome is the light and everything outside of it is uncivilized or unworthy, well, then we will have contention. We will have conflict, right? So the world system today, the inclusiveness or the contentiousness, is largely for Washington to decide. And that is not simply just because the U.S. has greater influence, but because it's the declining hegemon. It has a presence in almost every part of the world. All right, so with all of that, I hope you're still with me on this, right? And these are some big things to think about. Let's go back to some of the opening questions that we had within this class about Russia. Where does Russia fit with all of this? If Russia is an emerging global power, and if not global, definitely regional, what is its power? What is its capabilities? What's its influence on global affairs today, right? Especially vis-a-vis the United States, China, and the European Union? This was I think the prime question that was asked, and it's the one that has been carried through these last 5-6 weeks. Where does Russia fit? What's Russia's role to play? And to that, we asked, is Russia an aggressive power? Is it a defensive power? Or is it just simply a great power? Now, it's clear to some, most likely Ukraine, and definitely the Baltics, that Russia is an aggressive power. And to many political leaders in the United States, none of whom I will say are astute, but they have influence, and they have authority, and they have power. You don't have to be an intellectual genius in the United States to have power. And I'm not just thinking about Joe Biden or Nancy Pelosi. I'm thinking about Lindsey Graham as well, or when he was alive, John McCain. Right? These guys were rabidly Russophobic, and would go on any show saying that Ukraine is the first and last stop here. If we don't stop Russia at Ukraine, they're going to resurrect the entire Soviet Union, which shows that they have no grounding in history and less understanding of Russia's post-communist developments. So is Russia an aggressive power? Is it a defensive power? Does Russia have to be aggressive in order to be defensive? Is Russia saving Ukraine from itself? This is a rather contentious and controversial one. Or can we take a step away from liberalism here and say, is it a great power? And a great power just does what great powers do. Great powers yield influence, they exert coercive diplomacy, and they have a certain responsibility in maintaining a security apparatus within their areas of interest. China has it in the East Asian, East China Sea. Russia has it in Central Asia, most of the areas of the former Soviet Union, and the United States has it, first and foremost, in the transatlantic network of alliances, as well as maintaining tactical and comparative advantage in Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And if you're simply fine saying that, well then blow the dust off of your 19th century international studies textbooks and get yourself acquainted with realpolitik. This is the age of Bismarck. And instead of Bismarck, we have Putin. And Bismarck was despised at the same time as Putin was. He was also widely respected because the man knew how to play the diplomatic game. The story is still being written with Putin. But right now, he seems to have defied all odds and, as I said in the beginning of this discussion, keep Russia in a tactical advantage. So, are we then reading Russia right? And this is where the constructivists come in, because the liberalists certainly are not. The realists do a better job, but I don't think that they're nuanced enough. You know, the constructivists are kind of like the people that got degrees in history, but ended up teaching in international relations. You know, hey, a job's a job here. But does our perception of Russia, and this is the key thing with constructivism, perceptions, do our perceptions of Russia reflect actual Russian intentions, or are our assumptions of their intentions based on our own challenged, and I have to say increasingly outdated, geostrategic outlook? So this goes back to that question that I asked 2 weeks ago. Is Russia justified in invading Ukraine? Is Russia justified in invading Ukraine, or Georgia, or any country for that matter, right? Is Russia justified in intervening in the way that it did? A liberalist will say absolutely not, right? This is a major violation of one of the fundamental charters of the UN. Got it, no problem. A realist will say it doesn't matter if one's justified or not. Might makes right, right? If Russia wins this conflict, they will influence the history books to say, yes, they are. From a constructivist point of view, I think the argument would say Russia had no choice, right? Russia was drawn into this conflict, and yeah, they made the first move. They threw the first punch. And of course, that's going to set the tone for the narrative. And that is going to make Russia the aggressor. There's no question about this. But even if you agree that Russia could have and should have done something else, was Russia right in being aggrieved? Does Russia have a point in its grievances against NATO expansion, against the United States, against the internal intrusion of Ukrainian politics by the US and elsewhere, that they're not helping the country become democratic? They're just changing around the tin pot dictators. That's it, right? There's no difference in that. There's some additional questions to think about and begin to conclude here. We are heading towards the end here, but there are some additional things to look at. We ask ourselves, are we reading Russia right? But we should also be asking, is Russia reading the world right? I think Russia is reading the world better than many parts of the world are reading Russia. Right? And that's me saying that, academically, professionally. I think Russia is reading the world better. Not maybe more correct, but Russia reads the world and realizes it's not just the West. Right? When Russia looks at the world, Russia sees a multipolar world. They've already made that, they've made their peace. And in that multipolar world, they're themselves, the Chinese, the Iranians, who else? The Indians, maybe the Brazilians, the Nigerians, the South Africans, the Egyptians, and yes, even the Americans, especially the Americans. Now, if the Americans want to be the one that doesn't play along with everyone else in the multipolar playground, well then, there's going to be defensive measures that need to be taken because, America's got nuclear weapons and they oftentimes shoot first and ask questions never. So Russia perceives the world as multipolar and one where regional powers cooperate over spheres of influence or, if necessary, compete with them. If, therefore, the European Union is going to go along with U.S. foreign policy and remain, heavily sanctioning Russia and fortifying whatever they can in Ukraine and just dumping in as much weapons and whatever as possible, well, that is one issue for Russia to deal with. But that also means that will push Russia into making more open gestures of cooperation with other countries. And that's where China and Central Asia and India and Africa and Turkey come in. Just recently, Erdogan agreed to do that whole purchasing gas through rubles thing, which stabilizes the Russian currency and puts a challenge on the idea that the almighty US dollar is the international form of currency. Does Russia have a strategy beyond defensive realism? Let's just say that Russia is reading the world and their foreign policy is, as it has always been, a defensive maneuver. And sometimes you got to be a little offensive for a bigger defensive picture here. But do they have a strategy beyond this that capitalizes off of the power vacuums left by American hegemonic decline? Right? Remember, if the U.S.'s whole idea is Wilsonian realism, officially Wilsonian realism, right? Safer worlds through superior firepower, and of course that comes through U.S. military bases, coupled with American consumerism. At the end of the day, hey, we like our KFCs, our McDonald's, our blue jeans, our consumerist items, our Starbucks. Okay, if that's what the United States is, fine. If the U.S. is withdrawing from certain areas, where can Russia then fill in that vacuum? Because China's whole presence, when it doesn't deal with Taiwan, is largely based on commercial pacifism, right? China's got one big issue for every country, and that is what's your take on Taiwan? And if your answer is Taiwan is an internal matter for you guys to deal with, we abide by your one China policy, not our place, not our business, China's fine with you. If you decide to think that Taiwan is an independent state that is fighting to maintain its freedom and democracy from this big, giant, bureaucratic, authoritarian dragon, think economist, think what the Economist would write, think what the op-ed sections of the New York Times would suggest, right? Let's arm Taiwan to the teeth to keep the Chinese at bay. Well, then they're going to look at you far more belligerently. What's Russia's thing, right? Sovereign democracy. Okay, sovereign democracy doesn't get the ordinary people excited, okay? Sovereign democracy is like the kids are not going to go nuts for Russian consumer products in the name of sovereign democracy. Cultural realism, on the other hand, might be. Not for everyone, but certainly for the emerging national conservative elements of the country. In which case Russia says, in so many words, you do your culture, right? We have our culture, right? It's Russian, it's Slavic, it's Orthodox, it's Soviet, it's this, it's that. Hey, Iran, you're Muslim. More to the point, you're Shia Muslim. You go and you do that. Initially, we had thought that after Recep Erdogan had converted Hagia Sophia from a museum to a mosque, because if there's one thing Istanbul does not need any more of, it's mosques. But you know what? He did that for political reasons, and it's like whatever. And this, of course, was a major affront, not only against Orthodox countries, but against the decent UNESCO cultural world. Everyone thought, oh, Russia's going to get in on this. They're going to, clamp down on Turkey for doing that. Russia's response was, it's an internal matter. Just don't glop over the mosaics, and try not to make a mess of the place. And that was it. Right? Turkey be Turkey. We were all thinking, oh, Russia's the big, Orthodox power. They're going to go to war with Turkey. No, they're not. Putin and Erdogan have more to get along with than any antagonisms, which is the reason why, right, the countries do see, they have their rivalries in Syria, over the Black Sea, every so often a Russian plane shot down by a Turkish missile. But then within a week or so, Erdogan kind of is very conciliatory, makes a whole bunch of agreements economic-wise with Putin, and you begin to realize who's the dominant and who's the receiver, right? So this whole notion of sovereign democracy, cultural realism, can be seen as, I think, an antithesis to American liberal cosmopolitanism, cultural relativism, and especially in this day and age, and this is an IR class, not a comparative politics class, and not a political, ethnic, cultural class, but the whole gender fluid, gay friendly, whatever it is that's coming out of the West that a lot of societies are wanting to safeguard against. Now, I'm not getting into that right here, but the whole notion of whether it's cultural realism or sovereign democracy is, hey, country X, if that's not part of your culture, you don't need to all of a sudden do that. And the best part about it is that you're not trying to get into the European Union, so you don't need a gay pride parade to make the Dutch, the Germans, the Italians, and the French happy, give you a little check mark and say, oh, that upped your application a couple of months, if not maybe a year or two. So a third and final additional question to think about is then, what is the outlook for Russian foreign policy after Putin? Right? Because, look, the man going to die at some point. He's either going to step down because the Constitution forbids him from running again. It's going to look like he might not be able to scrape together the support because of his repeated attempts at running. But I'll tell you this much. If he does step down, he is going to appoint a successor whom he will then tell the public, the Russian public, this is my successor, like he did with Dmitry Medvedev. And the public is going to overwhelmingly say, got it, and vote for this person. It could be Medvedev. It could be Lavrov. We don't know. But I think that it is safe to assume at this point, especially with the outbreak of the war, that sovereign democracy will continue. Right? This policy of Russian foreign influence, this is going to continue. The brochure, the model, the structure will continue after Putin, whoever holds the reins of power. Do not expect Russia to all of a sudden reverse gears and become this liberal Western democratic country. Russia had its chance, and the West had its chance in the 90s, even in the 2000s, to do that. But in order for Russia to do that, there needs to be a clear sign that Russia can, A, become a part of NATO, and B, become a member of the European Union. But that's not going to happen. That is absolutely not going to happen. So we default to realism. And at this point, sovereign democracy, if it does nothing else, simply serves as an alternative set of models, of narratives, for countries to abide by, to modernize, to develop, without having to buy into the Western neoliberal model, which continues to engage, I have to admit here, in ridiculous amounts of Russophobia. Well before the outbreak of war, even the Crimean case in 2014, Russia was, as I argued in the second lecture of this class, Russia was always seen as this other, right? Russia was never part of the West. It was never part of the us group. I think a lot of that has to do with latent patterns and memories from the Cold War. And if you look at our, current leadership, and they're all in their mid to upper 70s, lower 80s, I mean, we are talking about a gerontocracy. That's all that they know. Right? That is all that they know. For them, it doesn't matter. Putin is a czar, he's a party secretary, he is Peter the Great, he's Stalin, he's Lenin, he's Count Dracula, he's Darth Vader, he's a Bond villain. Russia is bad. Russia bad. Right? Russia bad. That's just been the big thing out there. And before it reemerged in Western media following the Crimean incident, I remember this was back in 2013, something like that. You might remember, what's his name, Mitt Romney, when asked which country is the most dangerous to the United States in the world today. And of course, every good politician is going to say Iran, 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 China, China, Iran, Iran, China, China, whatever. Romney says Russia. People kind of look at him and are like, okay, boomer. It's like Cold War is over. But suddenly, there are counter demonstrations in Ukraine. And these counter demonstrations are preventing, right, all the goodness of liberal democracy from coming to power. And then we got the Crimean incident. Then we got the Donbass incident. Then, of course, we've got the 2016 election, which, according to some people, are absolutely convinced that Trump came to power only because Vladimir Putin stepped in, right? Putin somehow entered into my mind and the minds of others and prevented us from voting for Hillary Clinton. I'm sort of giving away my own little secrets here. I live in New Jersey, so the electoral college thing makes my vote meaningless because New Jersey almost always goes blue. So you can vote for whoever or whatever you want. I, as a protest vote, wrote in Bernie Sanders because, hey, he's, my guy, and I think that we need health care. But, obviously it's people like me that ruined it for, the Western world. And I think that this series of narratives, all right, of Russia being this failed democratic experiment, this aggressive power that wants to prevent other countries from becoming a democratic experiment, have a lot to do with the sense that Russia remains a rival for American foreign policy, right? Russia remains the non-cooperative one. Russia has stymied efforts in the Balkans, in the Middle East. Russia is this big, dysfunctional, chaotic bear that, is the antithesis to the American eagle, whatever it happens to be. And look, let's be honest here. There also is this fascination, jealousy, loathing that American officials have for Putin. He remains immensely popular. He can get whatever he wants. Up until recently, I think he was, and may very well try to be again, one of the most powerful people in the world. And he's not a team player with the United States. That's the thing that annoys us more than anything else, is that you're just not a team player. China might be communist, but China gives us cheap products. Cuba is communist, but we hate Cuba. Now, is Cuba economically a challenge to the United States? Absolutely not. But, it's like 50 or so years, Cuba's just been like, thanks, America, but no. Oh, and by the way, we're still able to keep those cars since the 1950s operating. So we're doing pretty good. This is Putin. Right? Putin's the same one. Putin's like, no, I'm not going to play your game. No, I'm not going to just follow your orders. And I think that this was made clear in the Munich Security Conference speech that he made in 2007. This was, of course, followed, as we've already talked in this class, about Russia's refusal to cooperate with the United States over Kosovo in 2008, the subsequent invasion of Georgia in 2008, the support for Russia's own parastates, as opposed to just the America's ones. Then there's the counter demonstrations in Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, and of course, the Russophobia that permeated since Trump's election. Already at that point, I think, detached most Western media from reality, from sane reality. I mean, I'm sorry if this is becoming more of an editorial, but I have to admit, it's just an absolute insane reality to think that Putin and Trump are best friends. Here's the lowdown. Vladimir Putin doesn't give a damn about Donald Trump. He doesn't care one bit about Donald Trump. Trump may admire Putin for being the alpha male, but so does at least a dozen other leaders around the world. So it's not just Trump. And what does Putin think of it? He doesn't care. Like, he really just does not care. But, of course, it makes a good story within media, which leads me to, again, ask, are we really getting the news, or are we just getting a subliminal, editorial here? And I think the other thing with Russophobia, and this is especially true when it comes to Ukraine, Poland, Central Europe, the Baltics, is, where does Europe end? Now, where does Europe end? Technically, Europe ends at the Urals, which is a mountain range that, comprises the western 1/4 of Russia. So where does Europe end? And if you're west of that, you're Ukraine, you're in Europe. The Caucasus, right? Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, you're in Europe. Moldova, you're in Europe. Should you then deserve to be part of the European Union? Sure. But then, should you deserve to be part of NATO? That's another one. And in as much as NATO officially says our expansion is not meant to threaten Russia, it is. I cannot believe that these guys can be that stupid. If Russia is constantly responding by saying, look, this is making us feel rather nervous, and look at the security dilemma that is that is happening, maybe, just maybe, NATO should sit down with Russia and say, all right, here's the big picture, and we can see you as a partner, as a major ally, which I would say up to last year, up to December 2021, Russia would have been willing to do. As of now, Putin has said, that's it, we don't trust you anymore, and we're going alone, right? If this is what it's come to, so be it. This produces all of those editorials in the Western press about Russia's two chairs. They can either be a partner of the West or they can be a competitor. And the thing is that Russia historically has been really only sitting on one chair, its own, right? It's not the Western chair, it's not the non-Western chair, it's just the Russian chair, right? Russia is Russia. Russia's going to Russia, and that's just how it's going to be. And, just like China. China's not a partner of the West. China's going to China. India is going to India. This is the new world that we find. The BRICS are going to BRICS. And if Russia's the one that's telling everybody else, you don't have to march to the Western beat, well then sure, Russophobia is going to permeate within these elite liberal circles. And look, since 2008, definitely following the election of Trump in 2016, all of these fears, these prejudices, these misgivings have been affirmed. Pretty much so. So Russia is always going to be seen, and this is why constructivism, I think, is so vital to understanding international relations. Because you might think to yourself, all right, this is a ridiculous way of looking at Russia. I wish that people in power in Washington would pick up a history book, or just, maybe try listening to the full speeches of Putin and Lavrov, now provided by this channel with American subtitles, if I can just pat myself on the back here, to give you the whole picture. But the thing with constructivism is that they're not going to do that, right? They're not going to do that. Why? Because it's not in their interest to do so. Constructivism will let you understand that if you work in the State Department, in the Pentagon, if you work for an American IGO around the world, you have an agenda. You have an objective, and that is to promote the American interest in that country. It's no different than what Russia's doing, China's doing, Iran is doing, Turkey, what have you, right? But to suggest that the American brochure is the one that everybody should buy, should take, as opposed to the others, is a bit naive in this day and age. So if other countries like Syria or Serbia or India or Brazil or Egypt, or you get the idea, or Belarus, whatever it is, right? If they gravitate towards Moscow more than Washington, the understanding is that, well, these countries suck. Well, their culture is backward. They have no democracy, right? And it's kind of like this, it's almost like this knee-jerk response where it's like, well, if you don't want my product, then fuck you. And I think that this is one of the big problems with Russophobia today. It's gotten to a point where, people are calling for the banning of Russian athletes participating in, international sports competitions, Olympics, among others, where, even the, the International Space Agency, I forget the name of it, whatever it is, right? We decided we're going to decommemorate Yuri Gagarin, right? The first man in space. Why? Just because he's Russian. Or we're going to stop playing Tchaikovsky. Or we're going to prevent Russian students from studying in the West. Imagine this, right? Russian students in their late teens, early 20s, having the opportunity to study at an American or Western university, or more so an American university, and then being told, no, because your leader sucks, we don't want you here. Well, what do you think that's going to do to this otherwise non-politically engaged individual? Of course it's going to reaffirm prejudices of saying, well, if this is what the West thinks of us, well then fine, so be it. I'll take my intellect and I'll take my funding and I'll go elsewhere. And I'll study in Central Asia or or Gulf states or China or some other country like that, right? So if Russophobia continues, unfortunately, I think it's going to exacerbate tensions, but it just simply implies that not only are we not reading Russia right, we're deliberately choosing to read them wrong, right? I mean, another way of this was one of the Time magazine covers that followed Trump's victory, or this idea that Trump was being supported by Russia in various social media outlets. And of course, you can kind of look at the type of stereotype that it is, right? The White House is being taken over by what Western pundits think is the Kremlin. It's St. Basil's Cathedral. So looking at this, I have more to fear the Russian Orthodox Church than I do Vladimir Putin. So it's not Putin that we have to worry about. It's Patriarch Kirill, who has disproportionate degrees of power and influence. I don't know if he knows this, right? But again, we as Americans, we think St. Basil's Cathedral, that's got to be Russian. That's got to be Soviet. It's bad, right? It's absolutely bad in that sense. So look, the perceptions and the misperceptions of Russia in international relations are going to continue, right? Russia will be seen among Western democracies, among Western powers, as an agent of chaos and discord, right? Russia is keeping rogue governments in the Middle East in power, right? They're buddying up with the Iranians and the Syrians. They employ a type of coercive diplomacy against weaker states that might look to the West for development and integration, but Russia's like, no, you want to hang out with us, right? That's the idea, right? Without Russia, these countries would naturally gravitate to the West. This is that liberalist idea that Huntington warned us about, saying, no, that's not how it's going to happen, but you assume that to be, and when it doesn't, well, now you're aggrieved. So you're getting angry over something that you concocted in your own head. But more to the point, okay, so a country is now working with Russia, a country that has historical patterns of authoritarianism and imperialism. That's the Cold War stereotypes that come out. The best that Russia ever had to offer us, democratic-wise, was the 90s, under Yeltsin. But again, even there, right, Russia was sort of bumbling, stumbling. It was weak. It was laughable. It was harmless, right? Yeltsin was harmless. Putin comes across as a Bond villain. Putin comes across as some diabolical genius. So we can't work with him. We can't get him to just laugh it all off with us, right? And if that's the case, well, then ultimately what we really see is that Russia is just truly just exposing its fears of inferiority and its need to mimic the West, right? That's just it, right? And if you can't figure out anything else, go on to one of those Quora forums and say, well, what do we really mean by this? Well, it really means that they're inferior, that they feel bad about themselves, and it's a defensive mechanism. Russia, when we look at more sensible assessments, is an agent for stabilitocracy, right? So you've got Serbia, Hungary, Turkey, Ukraine, every other government, right? Central Asia, Brazil, Egypt, right? Countries that utilize top-heavy executive leaders for, well, as the name implies, stability, law, and order. This is less of a triumph of Russian foreign policy than it is, I think, a spontaneous but inevitable reaction against the statelessness of globalization and neoliberal capitalism. And this is especially true following the 2008-2009 economic crisis, when countries like Greece, Spain, and Italy, among others, right, fell prey to global economic trends, suddenly find themselves in economic dire straits, and the only way out is for a nameless, faceless bureaucracy of technocrats in Brussels telling them to effectively stop spending, right? Somebody outside is telling you, you want to lose weight, you want to go on a diet, just stop eating for a month. Starve yourself, literally starve yourself. And as a result, you end up undermining, eroding the sovereignty of your own country. This created a significant backlash with the rise of national populism. And the type of political leadership, not just by Putin, but also Viktor Orban, Yaroslav Kaczynski, Recep Erdogan, Donald Trump, Narendra Modi, Jair Bolsonaro, among Rodrigo Duterte, Gamal al-Sisi, among others, right? This idea of bringing the state back in. Now, within political science, there used to be this enormous collection of material, of research done on state theory. And as we're talking here, like 1970s, 1980s, Barrington Moore, Theda Scotch Paul, among others. And then we just kind of forgot about all of that. Globalization is going to solve everything. Neoliberal markets are going to make everybody happy. No, they won't, right? No, they won't. We see this backlash against globalization, largely attributed to the United States. And the type of leadership that is asserting itself now, that claims to bring the state back in, that claims to lead in the name of, when you don't have anything else, nationalism, religious and cultural identities, is suddenly going to find resonance in the handbook that might not have been written by Putin, but was certainly endorsed by him. If you want to talk about the origins of this type of sovereign stabilitocratic leadership, we need to look at the 1990s era presidents of Central Asia, right? Nursultan Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan, Islam Karimov of Uzbekistan, Saporamat Niyazov of Turkmenistan, Emomali Rahman of Tajikistan. Some of you are like, yay, we're making a shout out to Central Asia. Others are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. You know what? I think I'll do a separate lecture on that. All right, the origins of sovereign democracy coming from a part of the world that has not and most likely will not ever be under the sway, the influence of the EU, NATO, or the United States. But this type of state-oriented leadership is something that Russia has kind of looked to and said, all right, I'm taking this on. I am taking this on as a form of soft power, right? And we will talk about promoting and strengthening legitimate government, legitimate institutions, the legitimate constitutional laws of the state against the chaos and the social unrest that comes with color revolutions. And even though there might not be causation correlation, it is seen as such. Colored revolutions are seen as agents of the West. George Soros, the United States, globalization, corporations, these are the things that erode the state's identity. Sovereign democracy puts that back up. Okay? And if Russia is going to use that as its foreign policy model, then it is a given factor, right? It is going to be an influential force in both international as well as regional strategic studies. So what is Russia going to do? Russia's going to do what it has been doing, right? People are always trying to think, what's Russia's ultimate goal? What's Russia's motive? And folks, maybe it's just the adrenaline running through me right now, but Russia has been one of the most honest countries out there, right? Russia will tell you when they're going to interfere in the affairs of another country, and they're not going to sugarcoat it in saying it's for democracy and freedom. They're going to say because we're saving a part of the country from another part of the country. So, this is not to endorse nor to condemn. It's to acknowledge. And that's why I like being a constructivist. Because a constructivist just kind of looks at it and says, guys, it's that. Okay? It's that. Russia is going to do what Russia is going to do. Okay? And it's the responsibility of other great powers to take that into account, in the same way they take China's actions and America's actions into account. There's no major criticism, at least not up until recently, right? What's China's ultimate motive? China's motive is very simple: to buy up as much of another country's infrastructure for its integrated one belt, one road plan. If it works, fantastic. And if it doesn't, because of cheap labor or cheap supplies, we'll find out in a couple of years. But we all know China does not hide anything. Even as far as the United States is concerned, you can read through the lines. You know, when the minute that the United States starts talking about the plight of human rights in this one country, you can basically be like, all right, how far before the CIA starts screwing around? Wait for John Bolton to get on Fox News or CNN and basically talk about how great the country would be if we literally pulled off a coup. I mean, the man is one of the most dangerous people in Washington, but he's also one of the most honest. You know, so Russia's no different. Great powers are in fact going to do that. So this is how we got Russia wrong, right? We got Russia wrong because liberalist models that still permeate American foreign policy frame America's international engagement as integrative, cooperative, and popularly desired. And I think that that's run its course. I mean, for every country that wants America's involvement, there's been a military blunder. There's been in Afghanistan, or in Iraq, or a Libya, or even in, right, one of the most successful foreign policy engagements, Kosovo, for that matter, right? The Kosovo Albanians will fly an American flag before they'll fly their own Kosovo flag. And it's a disputed territory. It has no chance of getting into the UN, the EU, NATO. It's, you know, an economic basket case, and probably the biggest export that Kosovo has today are its own people looking to get out. And this is supposed to be a success story, and it's not, right? So even in that sense, right, American involvement in another country, I mean, unless American interests are absolutely reflected in the interests of the local people, American interests are going to always be preferred over that. And during the Cold War period, during the era of America's ascendant transatlantic institutionalism, followed also by about a decade or so of American unipolarism, this wasn't a problem, right? This was not a problem because the United States was the country that shaped the world more than anyone else. But when the U.S. runs out of steam, when their credibility becomes increasingly questioned, when other countries provide alternative models to regional development and conflict resolution, the United States goes through this psychological catharsis, right, about how can this be, and what are the rivals, who are our competitors? Oh my God, it's the Russians, it's the Chinese. We don't want them. They're not democracies. Look at the human rights violations that happen there. Look at the lack of political pluralism. So we will get Russia wrong by seeing Russia not as another multipolar power, but as a direct rival that is actively, purposefully, and consciously working to undermine America's efforts. Right? Almost to the point of some people saying, if it wasn't for a strong Russia, if it wasn't for a Vladimir Putin, all of our problems would be solved because we would be able to remain uncontested. And I think that that also is a very, very naive way of looking at it. Now, constructivists, on the other hand, as I've always said, formulate these perceptions, America's perceptions of Russia, as this adversary and as a threat to American-led international development. China is actually more of an economic competitor than Russia is, right? If I was to look at the multipolar world here and just break it down to three countries, the US, Russia, and China, the United States still remains at the top, comparatively speaking. China is number two, and within the next couple of years may very well overtake the United States economically as number one. Russia is a distant third. Right? Russia is a distant third. And yet, Russia is seen as more of a threat to the United States than China is. Constructivism is the only theory that will help us understand that. In the same way, the United States looks at Iran as a bigger threat to Middle Eastern security than Saudi Arabia, or even Israel for that matter. Israel, blank check. Saudi Arabia, far more authoritarian, far more tyrannical than Iran could ever possibly hope to be. Well, we love these guys. The Iranians can't do a single thing right. Same thing with Cuba. This little country 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and yet we just bristle whenever we hear about them. So perceptions and the way that we see countries is going to shape and continue to shape the foreign policy of not just the United States, but other countries as well. So Russia is understood in this manner through manufactured dissent, and there's a term that we use, paradigm blindness. In other words, we will always see Russia through tinted lenses that paint them as reds. They're constantly anti-American, they're anti-Western, they're anti-democratic. So no matter what they do, even if it is for the best intentions out there, are going to be seen as far more belligerent to the United States than China, Great Britain, Japan, South Korea, whatever, right? What have you. And this will also continue if there is the persistent yet outdated existence of American exceptionalism, right? This idea that we are this city on the hill, we are the Rome of the world, the light of the world, right? And any country that calls us out on this is obviously jealous, narrow-minded, and just downright evil. So, Saudi Arabia doesn't say America's evil. Iran chants death to America. So, that's going to get us all upset, right? Russia's going to point out that the United States is the empire of lies. China is just going to be like, Americans just like our cheap crap, okay? So the United States is going to respond in kind because as long as American political culture, and this has nothing to do with whether it's Republican or Democrat, it's amazing. The minute that you end up getting into that you become a real political contender, if you don't follow this narrative, your political career is over. I mean, I'm no fan of Donald Trump. And in my earlier years, I kind of liked Ron Paul. But and you all know who Ron, but not Rand, but Ron, right? Rand's father. When Ron Paul was running for U.S. president, and I think this was it was 2008, and he was in the primaries. And so he's running up against a whole bunch of other Republican contenders. Mitt Romney was one, John McCain was another, Jeb Bush, a couple of others. It's not worth remembering. But what made Ron Paul stand out, and what I really liked about him, among other things at the time, was that he was the only one to say that American foreign policy is flawed, dangerous, disastrous, and self-sabotaging. To which he just received, gasps of indignation from everyone around him. Ron Paul also went on to say that whatever crisis the United States is dealing with at that moment started with something the United States did without taking into consideration other countries 20 years earlier. So the reason why Iran is Iran today is because of the Iranian Revolution, which, if you know anything about the Iranian Revolution, overthrew the U.S.-supported Shah. And as Paul also said, whatever actions that we make in the present now will be dealing with the fallout and the consequences 20 years later. Now, here's the thing. He was right. Right? He was absolutely right. But he was demonized for being anti-American, for being a self-hating American. A whole bunch of people out on his on the stage for the primaries effectively went into that knee-jerk, well, you don't like it, leave thing, right? But he was right. When it comes to Trump, it's not that Trump is he's not criticizing the United States. He thinks that the U.S. is the greatest country in the galaxy, but he also, in a way, acknowledges that there are other countries out there that have more of a vested interest in some parts of the world than the United States does. So do we really need to ratchet tensions up with China? Would Trump throw Taiwan under the metaphoric bus, if need be? Would Trump abandon Kosovo? Would Trump go buddy-buddy with Kim Jong-un And actually, I got to say, that was probably one of the best things that he ever did foreign policy-wise. By saying, well, what's wrong with talking to these people? He went on record at one point saying, what's wrong with cooperating? What's wrong with working with someone like Vladimir Putin? And he was absolutely right about that. Because you're not going to get rid of these guys. But this creates this collective gasp, right? You can almost hear, right, the monocle fall into somebody's martini glass. In the New Yorker club here. It's like, oh my God, how could you possibly say that? Well, I mean, this is a realist point of view. And in this sense, he's derided, right? Oh, you're weakening America. You're undermining America's exceptional value. I mean, America's, I think what Hillary Clinton said this, right? America's great because America is good. Like, what the hell does that even mean? It means nothing, but it's just one of those feel-good moments that people just clap to or whatever. And so this is how we get Russia wrong. In the idea that we're great, Russia sucks, right? Who would want, everybody goes for American products, American music, American movies, food, fashion, clothes. What does Russia do? Who got crazy for borscht? Whoever got crazy for beets, potatoes, and cabbage? Russian literature, it's depressing. Russian music, it's equally depressing. Right? This is the whole mindset. American consumerism is great. Russian consumerism is niche at best. So then can we let Russia be Russia in a multipolar world then? I mean, this is one of the articles that is now in the recommended section, but especially now, in light of the Ukrainian conflict, can we let Russia just be Russia? And once they Russia themselves to a point, they can stop being Russia to everybody else. In order to answer this question, we need to expand this by asking, can we really accept a multipolar world designed around, sorry for the typo, designed around a potential clash of civilizations? Which doesn't have to be, but if you truly believe that your civilization, Western civilization, is the best one and needs to combat all the others, well, then we are going to have a clash. Does this limit the spread of democracy? Does this effectively say, okay, sorry, Ukraine, but, we got to think of the bigger picture. If you're a realist, sorry, Ukraine, indeed. If you are a constructivist, it's neither sorry nor whatever. It's just like, it is what it is. If you're a liberalist, no. We will fight and defend Ukraine to the last Ukrainian if need be. Hence the reason why there is just this collective will to prop up a country. Forget its own internal turmoil. Forget its own political extremism. Forget the fact that opposition parties in Ukraine are being prohibited left and right if they're seen as pro-Russian. Forget any of that stuff, right? Ukraine is the proxy against Russia, right? And this is where we stake our claim. Because if we don't, then we have to accept not only is there a limit to democracy, but more so, there's a limit to our soft power as well. Right? There's a limit to our soft, and I think that that's even worse. We can acquiesce on democracy. We don't lose sleep at night knowing that there is no democracy in Saudi Arabia. We do not lose sleep at night knowing that Jamal Khashoggi is murdered. We will lose sleep if the Saudis start buying oil in rubles. That we will lose sleep over. We will lose sleep if the House of Saud invites Putin more than Biden or whoever's in the White House. Because if these become the questions, then we're looking at them less empirically and much more normatively. What about American foreign policy in a post-Biden administration? Whether he gets reelected or what have you, it is clear, and it doesn't matter whether it's Democrat or Republican, probably even more so Democrat at this point, the increased belligerency against Russia, and this is really connected, I think, to this panic, this sense of panic, right? America's influence in the world is now clearly slipping. Do we let it continue to slip into this partially democratic multipolar world, or do we fight as much as possible, right? When do you give up When do you walk away? When is it still worth fighting for? If you're in the center of power, you don't want that happening on your watch, right? You don't want that happening unless you can come up with some explanation, right? Some narrative, right? Biden's in the White House, thinks we're going to withdraw from Afghanistan. We're going to hand power over to the local Afghan governmental forces. They'll be able to do the job. We've trained them well. I mean, for God's sake, we haven't even finished evacuating people off the airport. The Taliban are already entrenched in Kabul. And what's the response? Well, we already achieved our goals 20 years ago when we got, when we dislodged Al-Qaeda. It's like, okay. I mean, you can retcon all you want, but I mean, that's Vietnam. That's the Saigon, helicopter, 50 or so years later. So what is the United States going to do? This is a big question. It's not really just Russia, but depending upon what the U.S. does and how it responds will influence what Russia does. If, let's say, the next president or the next congressional leadership or what happens, whatever it comes into, let's say the United States finally realizes, okay, you know what, the game is up. We can't continue this proxy war in Ukraine. And it's not like it hasn't happened before. The United States at one point got tired of Vietnam. And we just decided to be like, you know what, whatever. We had just talked about Afghanistan. Will we throw Ukraine under the bus? My guess is we won't throw it under the bus, but we will come up with some kind of modus vivendi with Russia. But that is going to also come amid an enormous psychological fallout in the United States, given the level of support that Ukraine has already enjoyed, not just within political circles, but within the mainstream media as well, right? So do we abandon states like Ukraine or Georgia? Do we abandon Kosovo's path to statehood, right? Knowing that there is no path at this point. But do we continue to pump money, weapons, diplomacy, whatever, knowing that we're just maintaining a frozen conflict at best, a perpetual war at worst, because if we give up, we forfeit, and another country, whether it's Russia or China or Turkey or whoever, steps in? Do we abandon, right, people that we committed to helping? It remains to be seen, right, what will happen. Even within Kosovo, it remains to be seen. And where does Europe fit into all of this? Right? This is sort of the wild card here, because it's assumed that Europe is going to go along with whatever the United States expects them to do. That's not entirely true. There will be some countries like the UK and the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they will do like whatever. All right, maybe even Poland, just for that matter. But they are going to do so if it benefits their own interests as well. Right? They're not doing it just simply because they love America. They're doing it because they can profit off of that. But what about Germany and France? These are probably the two biggest defectors. At some point, the Germans and the French are going to realize, hey, listen, Putin, no Putin, Medvedev, Navalny, hell, it could be even the reincarnated corpse of Joseph Stalin, whatever. There's money to be made. There's infrastructural projects to finish. And, the United States has been talking about transnational institutional economic cooperation now for years without regard to political ideology. And at the end of the day, I hate to break it to you, but Russia's more important than whatever government is in Kiev or Kishinev or Minsk or Warsaw, for that matter. There are differing perceptions of Russia. And what's also the case that we haven't really talked about is it's not the status quo governments that are the bigger challenge, but it's the rising national populist movements that are not by proxy pro-Russian or pro-Putin, but they see the fallout. They see the consequences of entering into this either-or diode between Washington and Moscow. Russia is much closer to these countries. There's money to be made. There's infrastructure that I've already talked about. There's the flow of goods, people, and services. If the United States wants to cut all economic ties with Russia, well, then the United States can do so. But individual European countries can choose on their own, and we are already seeing this, as I've already mentioned, with Hungary, Serbia, with Austria, among others. Let's see where we are in November, December, January when it comes to France and Germany, right? Those are the two bigger ones. So at the end, as Lenin at one point opined, what is to be done, right? Что делать? What is to be done? Well, the first thing is to make a couple of realizations. And that is whether you're happy about it or not, whether you want it or not, whether, whatever, Russia has returned to the world stage, right, after a 30-year hiatus. In fact, Russia has been on the world stage now for more than a decade. Sometimes it's difficult for existing powers to realize this. Its activities have been both constructive as well as self-serving, right? There's no question about that. Russia is going to do what is in its own interest, but at the same time, Russia's interests can, if need be more inclusive. Hence, the whole idea of cooperating with the so-called REST, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Eurasian Economic Union, the loose confederation of agreements with BRICS countries, which, as I've already mentioned, other countries, Mexico, Iran, Egypt, Argentina, Turkey, among others, are thinking of joining. They've already applied to join. I don't know what the acronym is going to be at that point. In this sense, Russia is contributing to a multipolar international cooperative framework, of which I have already said the United States is, or at least is envisioned to be, a participating and active member in. It is not the League of Anti-American Bad Guys, as we would sometimes like to think, but it is, at least in Russia's mind, truly representative of an international community representing all the continents, all the regions, all the civilizations of which the United States is a key and most welcome member. At the same time, Russia is not, and nor will it be, a global power. It will be, at the absolute most globally, a partner as well as a competitor. Regionally, it can be a power, but not a global power. It doesn't have the capabilities of doing so. And the word is still out as to where Russia's leverage will be following the end of this conflict in Ukraine. If Russia wins in some capacity, right, if they win, their whole soft power will be effectively vindicated and justified. If, and this is a very big if, suddenly they withdraw and they lose and everything just, collapses, well, then Russia recedes into, a regional peripheral annoyance that might be needed to be consulted every so often. But all signs are pointing to the fact that Russia's claim as a global authority is through partnership and cooperation, not as a competitor. Right now, Russia does not see itself as a competitor to any other country. The relations between Russia and China are much more cordial than they might be antagonistic. And this is especially true when we look at the pipeline and road network that is being coordinated between the two of them across Central Asia. Russia's soft power is ideological instead of consumerist. This might give it the ability to remain interpretive, right? America's soft power is its pop culture, its goods, its products, its fast food, right? It's buy one, get one free. It's all you can eat buffet stuff. And trust me, right? As a, born and raised American, you can't go wrong with all you can eat buffets at time, right? There is a place and a time and an appreciation, right, for American pop culture. Do not get me wrong on this. But when that pop culture seems to be running ramshod over local cultures, cuisines, tastes, and fashions for the sake of turning as much of the world into a Control-C, Control-V strip mall, then yes, the ideology is going to counter that sense of globalization. And this is where the short-term benefits of Russian soft power comes in, as that ideology serving as an alternative to Western liberalism, Atlanticism, Americanism, whatever it is that you want to call it. And finally, if I can offer a bit of sage advice here, the United States has been thoroughly engaged with seeing Russia, if it does see it in Cold War lenses, as like Cuban Missile Crisis Russia, right? As Stalinist, early Khrushchev Russia. Not the Russia of the Reagan-Gorbachev period. Right? We tend to forget that the United States has had a rather cooperative and strategic relationship with the Soviet Union. Stuff that effectively gave the United States the leverage to emerge as this victorious power at the end of the Cold War in 89 to 91. So for all of the, American pop culture of us fearing the KGB and, communism everywhere and socialism undermining this and workers of the world unite and, just making America as just, a miserable place to live. Reagan and Gorbachev got along quite well. And the partnership that was seen between 85 and 89 resulted in a de-escalation of tensions, a resumption of cooperation, an increase in communication and information to the point where it almost seemed like the Soviet Union could have allowed Eastern European dictatorships to collapse and transition into something else. In a parallel universe, there was no coup that overthrew Gorbachev's government. And in that parallel universe, just visualize, Gorbachev most likely would have undergone a number of reforms within the Soviet Union to transform it into some kind of moderate, maybe even politically plural political apparatus without having the whole country break up. It would have just remained some kind of Soviet federation or whatever you have here, right? And in that sense, there may have been, within this conceptual scenario, a type of post-communist, post-authoritarian Soviet Union that was seen by the United States and a reunifying Europe as part of that community, right? Think of it in this way: the Soviet, this conceptual Soviet Union that did not collapse would have maybe either A, joined NATO, or B, made the United States realize that NATO is no longer necessary, but there is a new military alliance or a new type of partnership that can be more inclusive and reflective of the time. The point to be made here is that for all of the talk about Russia being antagonistic, belligerent, and all other negative connotations to the United States, there had been plenty of times where the Soviet Union or Russia was more than happy to work with the United States, always willing to work with and cooperate. Because, look, if I can quote Donald Trump at some point, right? It would be nice if, as he said, we actually got along with Russia. There's nothing wrong in saying that. He's absolutely correct. If you want to, don't like the guy, he's a broken clock theory, right? He's right at least twice a day. But it would be nice if we got along with Russia, since the structural nature of multipolarism that we are in the world today makes it both profitable and advantageous. Let me repeat that. The way in which the world is today makes it profitable and advantageous to get along with other great powers, regardless of ideology or orientation. If the goal is to maintain global peace and security, if additional goals are to tackle transnational problems like terrorism, climate change, human migration, resources, among other things, there is no one country in the world that can do this alone. And the way in which it's structured, the United Nations can at least raise the awareness, but it can't do anything about it on its own. It requires major powers to pick up the slack, to pick up the initiative. And here is where we can envision a multipolar world where the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, the Iranians, the whoever, put aside their ideological differences, but realize that there's greater challenges out there that require collective effort. And if this is something that can happen, then all of a sudden Russia goes from being an antagonistic rival to a key partner. Because, folks, it has happened before, right? I want to end on this idea that probably the best example of American-Russian partnership was in, well, ending the last World War, right? So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, I bring this class to a formal close, at least in terms of the time invested in Rutgers University. So for my students that are enrolled, this is basically all the lecture material that you need to continue, complete your projects. But for all of you following me on YouTube, and all of you really excited about this public scholarship initiative, I'm just getting started. So I am more than happy to take requests, suggestions, especially if you decide to become a Patreon sponsor. I'll listen to you even more. But we can talk about Russian foreign policy some more. There's a lot of things in this lecture that I would like to delve a bit more specifically in. We can expand to other subjects in political science and international relations. I'm just getting started with this, and I really, really enjoyed the time that I had up to this point. So thank you all for listening, and I will see you in the next lecture.